Hi, everyone. Welcome and good afternoon. My name is Benjamin Quinn, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, the Harvard University Division of Science, and the Harvard Library, I'm excited to introduce this virtual event with Stephen M. Fleming presenting his book, Know Thyself, The Science of Self-Awareness in Conversation with Elizabeth Phelps. I hope you're all well and safe. Thank you for joining us virtually. Today's event is the latest installment in our Harvard Science Book Talk series, which works to bring the authors of recently published science literature to our Cambridge community and beyond. In just a few days, on Friday, April 8th, we'll host celebrated economists Erez Yorli and Moshe Hoffman for their co-authored book, Hidden Games, The Surprising Power of Game Theory to Explain Irrational Human Behavior, moderated by Andrew McAfee. To learn more about this and our other upcoming virtual events, you can visit harvard.com and sign up for our email newsletter, or check out the page harvard.com/science for more info. I'll also be posting a link to our Science Research Public Lectures channel in the chat, where you can view previous talks you might have missed. Today's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our authors at any time during the talk tonight, click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. In the chat, I'll be posting a link to purchase Know Thyself on harvard.com. Your purchases and financial contributions make events like today's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore. Thank you to our partners at Harvard University, and thank you all for showing up and tuning in support of authors, publishers, indie bookselling, and especially for science. And finally, as you may have no doubt experienced in virtual gatherings, technical issues may arise. If they do, I'll do my best to resolve them as quickly as possible. Thank you for your patience and understanding. Now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Stephen M. Fleming is Professor of Cognitive Neuroscience at University College London, a Wellcome Trust Royal Society Sir Henry Dale Fellow at the Department of Experimental Psychology. He is also Principal Investigator at the Wellcome Center for Human Neuroimaging, where he leads the Metacognition group. Today, he is joined in conversation by Dr. Elizabeth Phelps, the Pershing Square Professor of Human Neuroscience at Harvard University in the Department of Psychology, where she researches the intersection of memory, learning, and emotion. This afternoon, Stephen and Elizabeth have joined us for discussion of Know Thyself, an extraordinary look into the science of self-reflection, which Cecilia Hayes, author of Cognitive Gadgets, calls an extraordinary book. Written by a leader in the science of self-awareness, it is both accessible and erudite, a self-help manual, and a work of scholarship. Whether in the doctor's office, the courtroom, or taking an exam, all of us, nearly all of the time, grapple with an essential, unavoidable conundrum. How do we know what we and others know, or as importantly, don't know? In Know Thyself, Stephen Fleming takes us into the science of metacognition, the ultimate human trait which teaches us the limits of our knowledge, enables self-awareness, and lets us think about the minds of others. I will end with the powerful praise of the brilliant Sam Harris, host of the Making Sense podcast, who calls Know Thyself a very interesting book on perhaps the most interesting topic. We've got a lot to learn this afternoon, so without further ado, I am delighted to turn things over to our speakers. The digital podium is all yours, Stephen and Elizabeth.
Thank you. Welcome, Stephen.
Yeah, no, well, thanks so much. Really good to be here, Liz.
All right, so I have my Know Thyself right here with some coffee stains on front and some notes. I want to say, first of all, I thought this was a terrific introduction to the science of metacognition. And, you know, as a scientist, I read these books and I'm like, how do you explain something as complex as the science of how we know ourselves and stay true to the science? And I want to say, I thought you did a terrific job of making it both accessible and also very, very true to the science. So I want to start by just, you know, for the people in the audience, you know, you talk about, you know, the topic is, the title is Know Thyself, the Science of Self-Awareness, but the title we often use in science is metacognition. So I was wondering if you could just start with sort of a definition of what metacognition is.
Yeah, of course. And it's lovely to hear that about the book too. I'm, you know, very grateful for those words. And I think that metacognition is a technical term that we use in psychology. In the book, I broadly use it to be synonymous with self-awareness. And literally, metacognition means cognition about cognition, or thinking about thinking. And it's come to, in a sense, be this catch-all term that refers to the general ability of the human mind to monitor itself. So to know what we know what we don't know, to estimate whether we made errors on simple tasks, to estimate confidence in our skills and abilities, and so on. And I think one interesting thing is we often take this for granted, and there's no real outward signs of us doing this. So, skills like being able to walk or play the piano or solve a maths problem, you can easily see someone doing that, but engaging in metacognition is not always so visible. But I think it's a really bizarre and wonderful thing that the human mind does. And it, as I kind of explain in the second half of the book, I think it does underpin a lot of what we consider to be key human achievements.
So I want to get into the book in a second, but before I do that, you are one of the world's experts on metacognition, but it's not a topic that has been studied scientifically for a really long time. So could you just say a little bit about, and it seems to be picking up steam as we talk in the scientific literature. So I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit about kind of the background of science on metacognition.
Sure, yeah. So I think it's something that, self-awareness as a topic has been something that philosophers and people in general have wondered about for thousands of years. Going back to the ancient Greeks, the title of the book really comes from this inscription on the Temple of Delphi, this advice given to the population of Athens to cultivate self-knowledge in the service of wisdom. And there was really this emphasis there on intelligence and skill not being enough. You need to really, in a sense, have this engagement in self-reflection to achieve this higher plane of wisdom. But it then, in a sense, went into this slightly strange phase in the philosophy of mind literature, where, going back to Descartes, self-reflection was almost used as this tool to access the mind, and it was considered this completely transparent window on what was happening there. And that, you could argue, that led to some of the early psychology, experimental psychology, people like Wundt and Titchener, who ran labs effectively asking people to introspect about what was happening in their own heads. And in a sense, that work got somewhat sidetracked because, for various reasons, the data there was somewhat variable from person to person, from moment to moment, and the tools weren't really there to analyze that kind of data. So then psychology as a field got pulled quite heavily over to behaviorism in the early 20th century, and self-awareness and metacognition were somewhat neglected. And I think it's really only been in the past 50 years or so that we've had the tools to really create definitions of metacognition that allow you to measure it in the lab. And that's what my lab in London works on, and we combine those measures with brain imaging to start studying how metacognition works as a cognitive process and also a biological process.
So the first part of your book is really building up, what are the things that our brains are tuned to do that have enabled this capacity for self-awareness, for metacognition. So I'm wondering if we could sort of start out with that. And then if you could also comment a little bit about, this idea that, some of them are shared with other species, some are not, right? So you start with uncertainty. How does processing uncertainty kind of enable us to have this self-awareness, or why is it a key component?
Yeah, sure. So I guess the insight there is that when we think of what's the kind of minimal definition of metacognition, is in a sense being able to know that you might not know something. So in a sense, having this second order perspective, this higher order kind of view on the fact that you might not know the answer to something. And fundamental to that is being able to entertain a sense of uncertainty, a sense of not being confident that you know something. And there's been this really interesting line of work over the past few decades in actually a completely different area of neuroscience on how the brain does perception, how it builds models of the outside world for vision, for hearing, and so on. And the idea there is that the brain has a really difficult problem to solve because it's locked in this dark skull. It doesn't have access to the outside world. It's just getting all these noisy electrical impulses coming in. And so it has to solve a massive data processing problem, which is in a sense reconstructing the world out there from these noisy sensory inputs. And one insight from that work has been that one of the ingredients in that reconstruction is an exquisite sensitivity to uncertainty. And the reason for that is that the brain, in a sense, needs to know which sensory inputs to rely on and which to discard. And we know that it does this really well from a lot of experiments that have looked at how people combine information across the senses. So one example of this would be ventriloquism, where the ventriloquist is able to, in a sense, throw their voice to the puppet. But one way, the way that seems to be done is rely on this bias that the brain has towards treating vision as more reliable than hearing. So we think that the voice is coming from the puppet just because we see the puppet's mouth move. And in experiments in the lab that have been done to test that linkage, it seems that what matters there is being able to track how certain you are about different sensory inputs. And when I mean track there, I don't mean in a conscious way. It's very much in an unconscious way that the senses are doing all the time, kind of pooling all this data together and being sensitive to the uncertainty in each of those modalities. And so one argument I make in the start of the book is that is, in a sense, one of the minimal building blocks that probably lots of animal brains have that enable them to encode a very simple sense of confidence.
And then you build from that to sort of talk about this idea of knowing when we made an error detection, or knowing, predicting when there's going to be an error, that kind of thing. So,
right, exactly. So then that minimal sense of confidence, that's all about the input we're getting through the senses. But then the other side of I think, building block of self-awareness that's shared across many different species is the capacity to predict and track our own actions. And so one nice example of this that I often use is that when you step on an escalator, a movie escalator, your body will automatically correct your posture for the fact that you get tipped forward slightly on the escalator, and you just don't notice that happening, but it's a automatic predictive mechanism that stops you falling over when you get on the escalator. And that can nicely be exposed by the fact that if you step on a stationary escalator, many people will stumble slightly because they've kind of got this unconscious expectation that they need to correct their movement there. And I think that again is a very widespread building block of self-monitoring. It's a process or a set of processes that are, in a sense, acting as autopilots for our actions. They're constantly monitoring and adjusting how we are acting in the world without us necessarily being aware of them. And so I think those two building blocks, the ability to track uncertainty and self-monitor our actions, those are two key components of any system that self-monitors. Probably many brains have these capacities. And I think you can then start drawing a line from the emergence of those capacities and then build up from there to think about how humans might have got conscious self-awareness.
So what's the next step? So, that is something that, most species can do, right? But then we get to sort of, I'm thinking about what you're thinking about, right? And then did that come first, or was it me, did I start to think about what you're thinking about, then realize I can think about what I'm thinking about, or how did this happen? Like, where do we go from here?
Right, yeah, so I think that, so one interesting insight here comes from work on the development of metacognition in children. And what seems to be the case from those experiments is that those capacities, those building blocks for self-monitoring and tracking uncertainty, they seem to be in place pretty early in life. And these experiments are hard to do, so there's not that many of them. But the ones that have been done have found these low-level confidence signals from the age of around 6 months old, and presumably they might be able to be discovered earlier than that. However, that seems to be in place much earlier in life than the ability to consciously be aware of what we know and don't know. And so young kids below the age of, say, 3 or 4 are notoriously bad at knowing whether they know the answer or not. So, I see this all the time with my son, who is 3, and I say to him, what's going on here? And he says, like, or I say, do you know what this is? And he'll say, yes. And I say, what is it? And he'll say, I don't know. So then you've kind of got this like disconnect between being confident about what you think you know, and then it kind of gets exposed. And there's been nice experiments done in the lab showing that metacognition is surprisingly poor before the age of around 3 or 4. And that's exactly the same age when children seem to start getting the capacity to think about other minds, to recognize that other minds exist. And one, I think, interesting hypothesis there that still needs to be fully fleshed out in terms of the experiments. But one interesting hypothesis is that there's, in a sense, common machinery in the brain for thinking about other people's minds and thinking about your own mind. And so then it raises this really interesting question, like what came first? And I think that's a really hard question to answer, because you'd have to, in a sense, time travel back and do studies on our evolutionary ancestors to figure out, like, did thinking about other people come first, or did thinking about ourselves come first? Like, how do these interact? But I think there's an interesting disconnect, really, between these low-level building blocks of self-monitoring that are shared among many species and this seemingly more human unique ability to just think about and represent other minds as being different from ourselves.
So since you brought up Finn, who you talk about in your book, your son, when do you expect Finn's metacognition to start to emerge a little bit more strongly? He's 3 now.
He's 3 now. Yeah, it's interesting, like watching him.
The developmental data, but and your personal experiments on your son. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, exactly. I mean, I think that the studies that have been done, they seem to identify this kind of window that's quite considerably post-verbal. It's not as if this goes hand in hand with language. He's perfectly okay linguistically, and then there seems to be this window around the age of 3, 3.5, 4, where it's almost like this representation of realizing that you might have a different view on a situation to someone else. So that's the hallmark of theory of mind, or thinking about someone else's mind. And before that age, the studies that have been done show that kids are more concrete. They think that everyone else sees the world the same way they do. And the idea is that as soon as we develop this kind of third person perspective on minds in general, we can then turn that on ourselves as well and recognize that we might have been fooled 5 minutes ago. We might not have known the truth 5 minutes ago. And that seems to be a really hard thing to do until you gain this capacity for theory of mind.
And my read of that literature is that once it happened, it seems so obvious that they can't believe it never was there, right? Like
right, yeah.
Like, of course I know that. But those brain regions that are involved in that, right? That's medial prefrontal cortex, right? But then you also find with metacognition, even areas farther forward in the prefrontal cortex, the frontal pole, seem to be specialized. So when does that emerge, like this sort of more classic metacognition regions that you see, and the types of abilities that you see? Yeah,
so the work that we've done quite a lot in my lab on looking at individual differences in metacognition, even in fully formed adults. Even when you kind of go past that developmental milestone, there's still plenty of individual differences in metacognitive prowess that we can pick up in the lab. And so this really is now looking at quite subtle differences between individuals in how well they can monitor their performance on simple tasks. So we asked them to,
Yeah, I was gonna say, could you walk through a sort of example experiment so people know what you're talking about?
Sure. Yeah. So one type of experiment that we use a lot in my lab is you get given a quite simple perceptual judgment to make. So we might ask you, are there more dots on the right-hand side or the left-hand side of the screen? And we can then very carefully control how difficult that judgment is for you by changing the number of dots or how bright the stimulus is. And we get you to make lots of these judgments. And after every single judgment, we ask you to rate how confident you feel in getting the answer right. And the intuition is that if you tend to rate high confidence when you're objectively right, when you're correct, and lower confidence when you're wrong, then that gives you a high degree of metacognitive sensitivity. So that's the number that we compute from your data that tells us how good you are at metacognition. And what we see is that there's quite a wide range of variation between people in that capacity. It seems relatively stable. So if we test you one day and test you the next day, it seems to be relatively stable. And it's also interestingly uncorrelated, at least as far as we can tell, in the general population with more classical measures of intelligence and cognitive function. So, and you can actually set up these kind of tests where we ask people their confidence in the answers to an IQ test. So there's this kind of like additional level of monitoring that goes on. And so the intuition is that you can actually be a very smart person, but be completely unself-aware of how you're carrying out a task, for instance. And so there seems to be this independent aspect or semi-independent aspect. And that's and in a number of studies now, we've seen that individual differences in your metacognition are linked to subtle changes in the structure and the function of these regions of the prefrontal cortex, the frontal pole that's right towards the front of the brain, and that is particularly well expanded in humans compared to our nearest primate relatives. And so we think that that's, we don't fully understand what that region is doing across the board, really, in cognitive neuroscience, but also for metacognition. But we think that it perhaps plays a role in mapping between these implicit signals of confidence and this capacity to build this higher level model of what's happening in your mind. And in terms of when that comes online, that it has a much longer developmental trajectory. So we can see that those regions are still maturing in adolescence, even in your early 20s. And when we study metacognition in the lab in adolescence, this is studies we've done in collaboration with Sarah Jane Blakemore, we see that that trajectory continues ongoing. So it's not as if you kind of get the age of 4 and it's set in stone. It continues developing and maturing throughout your teenage years.
Is there also some change with aging? Have you looked at that?
So we have. Actually, very recently, we had a preprint earlier this year on looking at changes in metacognition on these simple tasks in a age stratified sample going all the way up to, I think it was around 85. And surprisingly, that measure was pretty flat with age. So, and this actually is, when I say surprisingly, if you just took a naive view about prefrontal function, you would think, okay, it's gonna drop off. But there's been nice work from Chris Herzog's lab showing that there's this, in a sense, protection of metacognitive awareness into healthy aging. Even when other cognitive functions might be failing, there seems to be almost this outlying ability that is retained. And there's various interesting reasons why that might be. But we also see that in our data that there isn't much of an aging effect once it's kind of in place in your early 20s.
As someone who's aging, I appreciate that very much. But even when you have very good metacognition, right? There are circumstances where you don't, right? So can you just say a little bit about these failures that you see sometimes in metacognition and and consequences?
Sure. Yeah. So I think one interesting failure mode, if you like, is that metacognition, just like one way to think about metacognition is that it's trying to build a model of how you're performing on various tasks, and that's similar to how, or we think it's somewhat similar to how the perceptual systems of the brain build models of the outside world. It's just one level higher than that, and we know that perceptual systems can get fooled in various ways by illusions and tricks of the light and so on. And there's been similar illusions of metacognition that have been discovered and documented in the literature. And so one quite common one quite pervasive one, is the illusion of fluency. So if a task feels easy for various reasons, you might think you're performing well at it, even when you might not be. And this has consequences in a range of domains. So one clear, one area that this has been studied is in learning and education. People feel that cramming for an exam feels good. It's like, okay, I'm getting all this stuff in there. And yet, if you look at the data, then spacing out your learning over time has been well established in cognitive psychology as being a good thing to do. And yet people still have this metacognitive illusion that that's bad and cramming is better. And so there's all these kind of somewhat pernicious ways in which fluency gets into the game that might create this feeling that everything's going fine when actually we're performing worse. So that's one way it can fail. And then another way it can fail is in more extreme ways, if in various cases where, for instance, prefrontal function might be impaired either temporarily or in cases of disease or brain damage more permanently. And one way this can happen on a temporary basis is with stress. So there's been some work showing that the impacts of stress on prefrontal function can have knock-on consequences for metacognition. And so there's been work in the lab showing that if you put people under stress, then this can create an outsized deficit in metacognition. Even though your performance on the task that's being studied remains okay, your self-awareness of how you're doing on that task becomes impaired. And this is all consistent with this idea that what stress can do is, in a sense, create a bit of tunnel vision and reduce this third-person perspective on yourself.
In the age of COVID, that happens a lot, I think.
Yeah.
So the second part of your book is you already touched on some of this, sort of talking about like all the ways metacognition comes into play, you know, in the things we do in our everyday life. So you talked a little bit about learning. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit about that, and also speaking to the issue of self-efficacy, because I think that's a really interesting idea of something that modulates how we learn and how we perform.
Sure. So yeah, in learning, we think that metacognition gets into the game in several different places, and in fact, so the study of how children learn in classroom settings was really where the research on metacognition originated back in the 60s with Flavel's work in child development. The idea was that it's not just enough to understand how learning happens. We have to also understand how children start to realize they don't know a topic and how they become able to self-regulate that learning. So how they realize, okay, I don't know this, so I should spend a bit longer studying it, for instance. That's a metacognitive operation about how much we know. And so that's one way metacognition gets into the game. Another way is in a more exam-like scenario where you're being tested on something. After you put down your answer, you might retrospectively reflect on that and think, that wasn't great, I'm going to give that another go. And then the third way it gets in is before we even start doing anything, this notion of self-efficacy, which basically means your belief in being able to do something. And again, this has been a long line of work from in social psychology from Albert Bandura and his team has shown that those illusions of metacognition also apply to this notion of self-efficacy. So if I think I'm going to do something well, then that has knock-on consequences for my performance. It almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I think I'm going to do well, so first of all, I decide to do it. I put myself in a position to actually succeed. And second of all, you can have these subtle boosts in performance because of this initial belief in how well you're going to do. And that can also then have the flip side of that is that if you believe you're not going to succeed, and this has been well studied in the case of anxiety about certain classroom subjects, particularly mathematics, if you think you're not going to be able to succeed, you might avoid that topic, you might never engage with it in the first place, and that can create this vicious cycle where you might have been great at it, but you thought you weren't going to be able to do it, so you never even gave it a chance. And so again, that's a metacognitive judgment about your skill, about your ability, and that can suffer from all the same kind of illusions that we've just been talking about.
So going from learning, also when you think about metacognition, you think about your decisions, right? Like you make decisions about your decisions,
right.
Deciding this is a good thing or this is a bad thing. And is it similar, like there's good and bad consequences in metacognition for this? And also, if you could say, like, when there is a bad consequence, can you turn it off?
Yeah, interesting. So I mean, in decision making, this is something that we've been studying quite a lot recently. So looking at how people on relatively short timescale, so we get them to make a decision. Again, it's usually in one of these perceptual tasks, and we ask them, do you want to change your mind about the decision you just made? And what we find is that your metacognitive capacity predicts how good you are at, in a sense, reversing bad decisions. That makes sense because it seems to tap into a similar ability to think about whether you're right or wrong. But it also affects how you process new information. So we found that people who have good metacognition also then realize they might be wrong about something, and so they go and seek out corrective information. And that more broadly seems to be related to this personality feature that people sometimes call dogmatism, which is effectively meaning that you're very rigid and set in your beliefs and you think you're right and everyone else is wrong. And we've shown that that personality feature, some of the variance in that feature can be explained just by looking at your metacognitive profile on these simple tasks. And so we think that in that sense, metacognition promotes good decision making because it helps you realize when you might be wrong, change your mind appropriately, and seek out new information when you need it. But in another sense, and this is a separate line of work on, not in my lab, but people who work on skilled performance have suggested that in some cases it can actually become detrimental, because once you've got really skilled in a domain, and elite sports and elite musicians is a good example of this, you might get to a point where you don't need this kind of constant self-monitoring going on. And in fact, it can start to impair your performance. And again, there's been nice experiments done to show that that's probably the case. And so then the game becomes, how do I, as you say, how do I switch it off? And I think that, that's really hard to do voluntarily, but it does seem there's anecdotal data to suggest that people who are at the elite level of sport do seem to just be able to turn it off. It reminds me of this great essay by David Foster Wallace about Tracy Austin's autobiography, and he was really looking forward to it as this tennis fan, but he was then totally disappointed by it because she showed no awareness of what she was doing on the tennis court. So it was a really disappointing autobiography. But I think it contains a kernel of truth there, that maybe to be really able to handle the pressure in those kind of scenarios, you maybe have to be the kind of person who just has that completely shut off.
When you're making those quick motor decisions, but maybe other decisions. Now, so metacognition is basically sort of thinking about what you're thinking about, but do we always really know why we're doing what we're doing? Or do we sometimes do things and then kind of evaluate it afterwards or figure it out afterwards?
Yeah, so I think that the insights we have about metacognition so far, at least in the kind of work we do in my lab and other labs studying the similar thing, is based on these very simple tasks where we can, in a sense, there isn't really anything to, there's not much that needs to be explained about what we're doing. And all it involves is just monitoring whether we're right or wrong about simple decisions. But I think as soon as we start getting out into the real world, where the kind of things we're doing are much more complex, they often exist at this higher level of planning, of building this narrative about what we're doing, why we're doing it. Then there's, I think, a really interesting almost extension of these models that we build of ourselves that starts to become much more reconstructive. And there's been really lovely experiments done on this in patients with split brain syndrome, where for surgical reasons the hemispheres have been disconnected, and you can flash a stimulus that goes into one hemisphere of the brain that the subject can respond to, but because the language mechanisms are sequestered in the other hemisphere, there's no way that they can verbally report on that stimulus, but they can, in a sense, watch their actions and create a confabulatory narrative about what they just did. And the idea is that that kind of narrative construction might be going on all the time in healthy brains as well. It's just less obvious. And I think there's interesting work to do for the future on trying to connect up laboratory measures, laboratory experiments, brain imaging studies, and metacognition to this broader notion of self-narrative. And it just hasn't really been done yet. I think it'd be lovely to get kind of powerful experimental tools to probe self-narrative. And I just, I haven't done that work, and it would be, I think, great to start that kind of research program.
So that does speak to the legal system a little bit, right? People have to have intentions and know why they're doing things, and that weighs into the judgments we make.
Yes, yeah, and in what's interesting about the notion of responsibility, at least from a legal perspective, is that it relies on this idea that you had the conscious intention to do something, then you can be held responsible for it. And often the language, if you look at the legal definitions of mens rea that are used in, say, criminal cases, often the language there is all about self-awareness. It's about having awareness of your conduct, or you should have been aware. If you were negligent, you should have been aware of that conduct. And so I think it is interesting to think about like how metacognition seems to be key here for building up a notion of autonomy, of responsibility. And this relates to some arguments that the philosopher Harry Frankfurt has made over a number of years about, in a sense, like, what is autonomy? And the argument he makes, which I think is quite a compelling one, is that really what we mean by autonomy is acting in a way in which our higher level, our metacognitive level of desire matches up with what we're actually doing. And he gives the example of someone being addicted to drugs who says, I really want to stop, but I just can't. And contrasting that with someone who thoroughly self-endorses their drug taking. And you would, in a sense, feel more sympathy with the first person because they're struggling against that higher order desire to stop. And now I think there's lots more to say about that, and I don't want to get sidetracked into a discussion about addiction, but I think as an idea of why metacognition might be important for autonomy and responsibility, I think it's quite an interesting one. And we've done a little bit of work suggesting that people don't only create this feeling of confidence about perceptual choices, they also create similar feelings of confidence about more subjective decisions, things like what do I want to eat, or do I want to take this gamble or this gamble, and you can in a sense become aware of the fact you might have made a subjective error. It's like, well, initially I thought I preferred this thing on the menu to this thing, but now I've realized that it's the reverse. And over time, if you can start aligning your choices with those reflexive endorsements of those choices, that's what Frankfurt would call having autonomy over your life, effectively.
Interesting. We only have a few minutes before I'm going to get to questions. So I just want to briefly touch on, towards the end of the book, you talk about how all the sort of artificial intelligence and these new, the fact that we're letting machines take over a lot of the decisions, driving, things like that, how this, might interact with metacognition and knowing what we know and monitoring what we need to monitor. So could you just say something about that?
Sure. So I think, this is a literature that I've only recently got involved in. We're actually collaborating with some roboticists in Oxford at the moment on these questions. And one interesting thing there is that, as we've all seen, the developments in machine learning and AI have been phenomenally powerful over the past few years. But what's interesting about those systems is that, first of all, they're often hard to explain. It's often hard to create these narratives about what they're doing. But the other thing is that they often seem to be overconfident when you take them into situations that they've never encountered before. So this is called out of distribution generalization. So if you train a big neural network to classify some images, and then you give it an image that it's never seen before, it will often be quite confident that it is in fact a class that it has seen before, even though it's totally wrong. And obviously you wouldn't want your self-driving car to be overconfident about a new situation. So there's a sense in which, like, if we can start building in these more global levels of confidence into artificial systems, then not only might that be useful for handing back control to the human operator, so the system would in a sense say, I don't know, I've never seen this before, and hand back control. But the other thing that we're working on with the guys in Oxford is we're hoping that this might just create a bit of a higher level of trust between us and AI systems that often seem like black boxes. If they can, in a sense, publicly communicate how uncertain or confident they are on a routine basis, it might feel more natural to trust and interact with them.
Fascinating. So before I jump to the questions, there's lots of good questions. I wanted to ask you, I had lots of personal things, but how are your metacognitive abilities? You say people vary quite a bit. You must have tried it out yourself.
Yeah. I think it's hard because the problem is, like a lot of experiments in psychology. Yeah. You know how the system, how it all works. Yeah. I do. I think like anyone, I struggle with this in my everyday life. I find the stress thing quite hard. Is I notice, if I'm got a deadline, a grant deadline, or whatever it is, then I kind of become a little bit annoying to live with. And it's only after the fact that I realized that I probably was a bit annoying to live with. So it's that kind of level of more emotional self-awareness that I think like all of us, we often struggle to handle.
All right, there's so many great questions, so I'm just going to jump to them. So Jennifer Nixon asks if you can comment how your research interacts with the functions of mirror neurons.
So I think so the idea with mirror neurons is that there are a subset of neurons in the brain that seem to activate not only for actions that we perform, but actions that we see another person performing. And I think that this is very related to this idea that one component of being self-aware is being able to recognize yourself. And this has been tested in animals with the mirror test, being able to, in a sense, create this correspondence between your own body and the image you see in the mirror. And I think that this is, a really important component of bodily self-awareness, like knowing my arm is here, my hand is here, and so on. But I think that is somewhat distinct to mental self-awareness, being aware of what's happening in our own minds. But interestingly, they might be linked. And there's been some really clever developmental work suggesting that if you measure mirror recognition when kids are around 18 months old, that statistically predicts the emergence of these more mental levels of self-awareness. So there's a lot to be done to understand how all those things interact.
Interesting. We have two questions about gender differences. Let's say, and basically saying one asks, that it seems like overconfidence, things like that, might be self-doubt, might vary by gender. And does that relate to metacognition at all that you know of?
So in the data we've collected, and we've now collected data from, thousands of people on these simple tests, and we don't see much gender differences when we look at what we call metacognitive sensitivity. So the capacity to track on a moment-to-moment basis whether you're right or wrong on the task. But what we do see, and this has been shown in most strikingly, I think, in studies of self-efficacy. This has also been studied in the classroom in children when they're asked to rate how well they think they're going to do in various tests. There are gender differences there, and this might where girls seem less confident than boys, particularly in STEM subjects. And the problem is that, as I was mentioning earlier, that can create this vicious cycle where there's no initial difference in ability, but if you think you're not going to do well at it and you don't then take on that subject, then just by definition, you will then have that mismatch in, say, engagement with that particular subject. So in terms of self-efficacy and average level of confidence, absolutely, there does seem to be quite reliable gender differences. But in terms of your metacognitive monitoring capacity, if you like, that doesn't seem to differ very much.
Interesting. So Mark Pizzato asks, how have developmental neural networks of metacognition been studied regarding cultural influences or cross-culturally? Are more individualist, independent, or collective interdependent models of identity, do they affect metacognition in any way that you've identified?
I feel like this question is like a plant for me to advertise our recent study.
Way to go, Mark.
So, there's two things to say on this. So the first one is that just on a theoretical level, we think that culture probably does play a strong role in the extended development of metacognition. Because it has this long developmental window going into adolescence, it seems to be codependent on mechanisms involved in thinking about others, which we know from studies are culturally influenced. And so we actually did a study recently with colleagues in Beijing, in fact, Jian Li, who Liz knows well. And we compared these objective measures of metacognition in samples in London and in Beijing. And we found, to cut a long story short, we found that the Chinese sample has slightly heightened better metacognition than the London sample, and that was replicated in 2 experiments. And we speculate in that paper that that might be, as you say, Mark, related to this more collectivist, interactive culture in China compared to the West. But that hypothesis would need actual testing.
Interesting. So an anonymous attendee asked about the relationship between metacognition and autism.
Another great question. It's so to the extent to which theory of mind and social cognition goes hand in hand with metacognition, you might expect differences in metacognition in autism. And that has been recently tested, but there seems to be there's conflicting results in the literature. Some studies find impaired metacognition in autism, some studies don't. There's a very recent study suggesting that any impairment is more about this conscious level that's related to thinking about others, rather than the lower level representation of uncertainty and confidence, which seems to be intact. I think there's a lot more to be done on this. And I think what really needs to be filled in there is a more theoretical model of why it might be different, how it might be different, to have hypotheses to then go and test. Because at the moment, the samples that are being studied are quite small. Sometimes the result you get it, sometimes you don't. So think the jury is out there, but I think it's a fascinating question.
It's another question from Dorothy Barr. How about other animals' metacognition? She's thinking about elephants and bonobos. But we talked about this a little bit. The building blocks were there, but I mean, how do you know?
Yeah, it's another great question. I mean, I think so. One thing to say is that it used to be thought that metacognition was, in a sense, a uniquely human capacity, and that line has definitely become blurred, because in pretty much any test that can be developed for humans, many animal species can pass this test because it effectively involves creating these feelings of confidence or uncertainty that we do think have widespread neural correlates in animals. And so when tests of confidence estimation have been devised for rats and monkeys and dolphins and chimps and pigeons, there's a whole range of studies that have been done. Most of those species show sensitivity to uncertainty and confidence to a level that allows them to then self-monitor whether they're right or wrong on simple tasks. The thing that is kind of the $1 million question is, like, does that then create any kind of minimal conscious self-awareness? And I think that's a really hard question to ask, because the way we answer it in humans is to get them to create these verbal judgments about what they think, what's going on in our minds. And obviously you can't do that with animals. You can perhaps rely on the indirect link to theory of mind. And there, the tests of theory of mind that have been developed seem to not be passed even by chimpanzees, although there's some suggestion that they might pass them in terms of the patterns of their eye movements, just the kind of implicit glimmers of being able to be sensitive to the beliefs of other people. So I think in that sense, like, again, it's what I would love to know, and I know there are lots of animal researchers out there who are thinking along similar lines, is could we come up with a gold standard test of conscious metacognition, and then start applying that in both humans and animals?
So an anonymous attendee asks, does having really advanced metacognitive function or being overly sensitive lead to self-doubting or excessive self-criticism? After you enact and you realize you made a mistake, is there any relationship or other personality? That's me asking about other personality traits that you know of.
Yeah. So we think that the capacity for metacognitive awareness of performance and your overall level of confidence are relatively uncorrelated in the population. So now, obviously, there's a sense in which they collide. So if you're always 100% confident, you're also gonna have poor sensitivity. But there's a space in which you can be aware of making mistakes, but still, in general, have a high degree of self-belief, of self-efficacy. And in terms of links to other personality characteristics, we've done some studies on this linking to mental health symptomology, and we find that in a way it goes the other way. So we find that in people with greater anxiety and depression symptoms, you do have this cluster, which was described in the question, where you have a lower overall average confidence, but you also have, perhaps in virtue of that, you have also good sensitivity because you're acutely sensitive to when you make errors. And interestingly, the profile of people with more compulsive behaviors, things like alcoholism, other types of addiction, goes the opposite way. They tend to be quite highly confident and less aware of making errors on the tasks. And so sometimes these are interlinked, but if you just look at a big general population sample, your overall level of confidence is not necessarily predictive of how good you are at monitoring.
Interesting. So Jennifer Nixon asks, since good metacognition is a net plus, are there ways to improve it on an individual basis or on a cultural basis?
Yeah, well, we think possibly. So we've done some recent work in our lab looking at training of metacognitive sensitivity, and this is over an extended timescale, so several sessions over a couple of weeks, and we're giving people tailored feedback 20 minutes a day, telling them how closely their confidence tracks their performance. And we do see gradually, it's subtle, but we do see gradually over time, this ticks up. And it doesn't happen in a control group. You just got feedback on their task performance itself. And we've actually recently just finished a brain imaging study of this, doing exactly the same thing again, but looking at measures of brain function and how confidence is encoded in the prefrontal cortex before and after training. And we're analyzing those data at the moment. So I think possibly yes, but I also think that the individual differences work kind of goes against that prediction, because we see in that work that things are relatively stable. If they weren't stable, then we wouldn't be able to discover things about the relationship between metacognition and overall structure and function. So I think there's work to be done to kind of figure out how malleable things are. And perhaps there's certain windows of malleability. For instance, in adolescence, that would be one obvious place where you might think there'd be a window of malleability. But I think it's a really cool question, and it's something we're definitely pursuing.
So I think we're running out of time. I'll ask one final question, if you don't mind. Of just, what is the next big advance you think you'll see in metacognition? Like, where do you think the science is going that you'd find sort of really fascinating if it could go there? Is there anything in the back of your mind you wish you knew that you don't?
Yeah, I mean, I think these connections to self-narrative, the stream of consciousness, I think that would be really interesting if we could get tools to measure that. I'm also becoming increasingly interested in whether the mechanisms supporting metacognition, are they important for consciousness, for giving us conscious experience? And this is a hypothesis that is comes mainly out of philosophy, but it's starting to get some traction in neuroscience as well. This idea that just the capacity to be conscious of the outside world might in some sense rely on higher order awareness of perceptual content, of perceptual mechanisms. And that's something that we're quite excited about testing. And if that turns out to be the case, then that would provide us with some kind of insight into how we become conscious in the first place. Rather than thinking of consciousness as something that enables metacognition, perhaps it also goes the opposite way around.
Wow. I feel like psychology always comes back to consciousness at some point.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you so much. That was awesome.
Oh no, thank you, Liz. That was great.
And if you haven't read it, like I said, I think it's a really good combination of really good science, but explaining it in a really clear way. So good job.
Thanks so much. It's been great.
Thank you both for this fantastic conversation. Thanks to all of you out there for spending part of your afternoon with us. Please learn more about this book and purchase Know Thyself at harvard.com. I put the link to purchase in the chat a couple times. On behalf of Harvard Bookstore, the Harvard Division of Science, and the Harvard Library, all here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, enjoy the rest of your day, keep reading, and be well. Thanks again, Stephen and Elizabeth, for joining us today.